As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect. It's been a long time coming, but we're back talking about, I could probably say, our favorite topic to speak about, the continent of Africa, Pan-Africanism in this moment. And joining us, voices you are familiar with, my good friend, Christian Joseph, and my uncle, mentor, Professor Zubairu Wai. Welcome back to The Malcolm Effect. How are you?
I am good. It's always nice being back and talking to the youths. So it's nice.
Thank you, Uncle. It's good to have you on today. So I'm so happy that you agreed to be a part of a 3-part series. So guys, we have a 3-part series in which we will be engaging how we come to think and write and theorize and engage the continent of Africa at an academic level, but also we hope that we can bring some threads out that will inform discourses going forward when we're talking about organizing and becoming active. So today's episode is dedicated to the debates in the continent of Africa, particularly centering Mudimbe and Ngugi or Thiong'o, which I think is important because these two thinkers kind of generate so much thinking about the continent of Africa. But I think before we get into the specifics, Professor Zubairu Wai, the first question I have, now bring out some threads. When we think about what is the challenge talking about debating and theorizing the continent, what are some of the challenges that come to mind?
Oh, thank you, Mohammed. By the way, you might want to check. Your voice is getting muffled as you are going through this.
Okay.
Speakers. I mean, your listeners may have a problem, so maybe you will have to re-record that part. But
okay.
How do we start? I think we have to start always when we're talking about Africa. There are 2 ways we could approach this. We have to start with the understanding that Africa existed before the European encounter. And therefore, there were processes that were on the continent which were organically conceived and they were moving in their own directions. And then the advent of modernity, and I'm thinking of it with the arrival of the Europeans, the process that the expansion of Europe in the 15th century onwards unleashed, created for those organic processes on the continent. So on the one hand, Africa had its own historical development and trajectories. It was not isolated, it was linked to the world. But on the other, beginning in the 15th century, with the advent of the Portuguese, beginning with the Portuguese, but the Europeans generally, that will unleash a process, the expansion of Europe that will unleash, and the politics that it unleashed, the process of continent grabbing, enslavement, dehumanization, colonization, and all of that, created a problem. So on the one hand, there is organic historical processes, African. And then on the other hand, the advent of modernity interfered with that. And as a result of that, Africa itself then got codified within a library, what Valentin Mudimbe calls the colonial library, an archive, so that it becomes very, very difficult to be able to get to those organic historical processes that we are describing without recourse to the archive that already has been constituted through the violence of colonial modernity. And so to think out the challenge of thinking about Africa, really being a student of Valentin Mudimbe, is to say it's the constitution of the colonial library. Now, what exactly is the colonial library? Well, the colonial library functions in a similar way as Said's notion of Orientalism. It is an abstraction for the immense body of text and discourses over the centuries that have constructed and continue to construct Africa as a paradigm of absolute otherness, a paradigm of difference. And this library, it's not to say that it is totalizing, but the power of the library is that even those who try to rethink Africa, those who try to engage in different kinds of politics, or even those who try to go to those organic texts and processes to retrieve them that I was talking about. Because of the violence of colonial modernity, it becomes very difficult to do that without recourse to the library. So that those who want to speak with their own voice are always under threat. Now, I'm not saying that always they reproduce the violence of the library, but they are always under threat of of thinking of themselves, of speaking the language of the library to describe themselves. So you don't come to Africa innocently. You always come to Africa through these processes. So to answer your question, the short form is, it's not just the political processes through which African integrity and sovereignty and self-actualization and processes of rethinking and reimagining and rejuvenating the continent have been stunted. There is also an epistemic dimension to it, and actually that epistemic dimension, as a result of the representational and schemas of colonial modernity and its archival configuration. Its archival configurations makes it very difficult to talk about Africa as a normal place, to talk about Africa as a place that, parents love their kids. We cry, we die, we live, we eat food, we dance. It's not just this one pot of misery. It's like a multiplicity of human emotions and processes exist in this space. But it becomes very difficult for us to be able to get to that because most of the time there is a gaze of the library. And when you mention Africa, then there are all of these demons that comes from the archival configuration of colonial modernity. So I'll give you an example. I teach this course at the University of Toronto, Africa in the World. It is a fantastic course because the way in which I approach it is to say Africa has always been a world historical region. Like the fact that we even have to say that is the scandal. The fact that we even have to prove to people and say, oh, Africa has humanity, it has history, it has all of these complex processes. It is a scandal, but that's usually, so we go through the course to really show how the continent has always created and it continues to be a central region in the production of global power, the production of global politics, the production of history, like all of this. But to start the course, I usually start asking my students to tell me, honestly, when they think of Africa, what is it that comes to mind? And you'll be fascinated to think of some of the things. I mean, some of the students are already second-generation immigrant students who come from Africa, and so they are like, oh, it's home for me, it's the motherland, and all of that. But for those who do not have that kind of historical and cultural and familial relationship with the continent, sometimes it's about safaris and animals. It's this terra incognita where people do not exist, but animals exist. Or it is this place where a tragic human history and experience stands revealed in terms of famine and poverty and wars and misery. And so then when you are teaching a course like this, it actually becomes a struggle because on the one hand, you want your students to have like a positive and engaging learning experience. But on the other, I cannot teach a course like this and allow some of those stereotypes to go unchallenged. And so it becomes like really very difficult to be able to balance teaching a course like this. So most of the time, I will start with where you have started by saying, yes, there is an objective fact that is Africa. There are 55 states, including Western Sahara. There are like maybe 1.2 or 1.4 billion people. It is over 25% of the land surface in the world. It is like huge. It has all of these diverse cultures. And when it comes to like diversity, Africa is the most diverse place in the world in terms of language and culture. But even in terms of like DNA, genetic coding and all of that, the tallest people are in Africa. The shortest people are in Africa. The smartest people, they build the pyramids and the walls of Zimbabwe. They are in Africa. And I am sure the dumbest people are also in Africa, actually. You have the hue in terms of the skin color, like from one that pass to near white to the ones that are as dark. Like you look at the Dinka, for instance. And so this is where we start. But then to say, despite these historical facts, there are still all these objective facts. Those facts do not just speak their own language. They do not just. So how we engage them and how we interpret them then becomes the challenge. And the thing then is that there is always the gaze of the colonial library that forces the subject that want to speak with their own voice to imitate, to condemn themselves in the language of this archive that I just described. So anyway, if you are saying where do we start and what the challenge is, that is actually the challenge. To the point that Africans themselves use those particular Eurocentric standards and systems of representations that have been codified in this archive of Africanism and the colonial archive of African devaluation to talk about themselves. And I'll say this, the last podcast I think I mentioned this, and I'll try and end here. Take the Yoruba. The Yoruba, you are talking about millions of people. They have some of the most complex cosmologies and cosmogonies in the world. In terms of culture, in terms of, they have everything that you could think of in terms of creative culture, their relations with the cosmos, the Yoruba cosmologies, the art that they produce and all of this. But the British just came and said, they are a tribe. And to these days, somebody will say, oh, I'm a Yoruba by tribe. How are you a tribe? Because there is an evolutionist gaze that says Africa is always the primitive foundation of conventional history and Europe is the advanced state. So you take a country like Norway, 4 million people, they are a nation. And the Yoruba, millions of people, they are a tribe. So those are some of the challenges that exist when we think of Africa or how to think about Africa.
No, I think that was a brilliant first response. Christian, do you have a follow-up or a question?
I guess I want to interrogate that last point about, the designation of tribe to various ethnicities within Africa, and just your thoughts on the concept of the nation state. I guess the reason I ask this is because, what came to mind as you made the distinction between Norway as a nation or being designated a nation versus Yoruba being designated as a tribe is what then becomes the push to develop some level of sovereignty and political power amongst Africans. And what designations do we claim or do we put forward in order to develop some sort of liberatory project for African peoples? Is the category of nation state even appropriate for putting forward a liberatory project?
Okay, thank you for that. But I didn't say nation state, I said nation,
sorry.
Right?
Yeah.
And the idea of nation state is problematic in the sense that there was this understanding that there is an essential quality of certain people groups in terms of cultures that constitutes a nation. And then that nation itself then constitutes a state. So the state is it's a geographical unit that claims sovereignty. It claims sovereignty. It has a constitutive population, right? It has a constitutive government, and then it claims sovereignty over a fixed territory. So that is the state. The nation, however, signifies more like a political entity with inherent ideas of culture, cultural linkages and stuff. But it is situated above that of the tribe, right? It is like the higher form of political and cultural consciousness within a given space. It doesn't necessarily have to be bound by territory. And so, but then the nation also claims political sovereignty for a particular group, like people group, right? Now, these are all problematic ideas that developed over the time. But in the 19th century, especially European nationalism, which basically gave us the First World War and gave us colonial expansion, had this crazy idea that every nation is supposed to be a state, or every state is supposed to be constituted by a nation. And so then the nation becomes the marker through which the state itself gets. I mean, you already start seeing the problem that exists with this idea of the conflation of the state with that of the nation. But then the idea definitely was that. So in Europe, there were all of these movements, right? And then that led to colonization. But once you have created this idea of the nation as the higher form of cultural and identitarian political consciousness that demands sovereignty as the basis and self-government as the basis of its existence, then if you are colonizing people, you are not going to grant them the idea that they are nations. So tribe, which actually also has a colonial pejorative connotation, it is basically an evolutionist concept or category that tends to indicate a lesser or backward nature of political organization, get flapped and labeled on everybody else that the Europeans were colonizing. You can't say that they are a nation, because if you say they are a nation, by your own definition, they have the right to claim political sovereignty, inherent sovereignty, and self-government over their political organization. You can't say that. But that was not the only reason. But politically, that is the implication. You can't say that. The other thing, though, then, is that you also look at Europe and say Europe is the advanced state, right? It's the advanced state where the political community has been formed. So if you go to Hobbes, for instance, right? We were all just chilling in the state of nature. And then some people got up one day and was like, hey, why are we here fighting and killing each other? Let's create the political community. So that move from the state of nature, it's a progress that then leads to the formation of the political community. But if you read Hobbes very closely, his example of the state of nature, and this is why sometimes I get so frustrated with people. They were like, oh, well, Hobbes was using a thought experiment. I'm like, well, no, he was not. Because if you read him closely, he says the Americas, the indigenous people of the Americas, actually represent to this day the example of the state of nature that he's describing. So he's looking at what is happening, looking at indigenous people and saying they don't have the kind of political community that we have. They are primitive, they are all of this. But the significant point here is that there is a progression. That progression is what brings the political community and politics afoot. Europe then becomes what everybody has to aspire to, and everybody that has not gotten to the point of Europe then is designated a tribe, is primitive, and all of these ideas, the neologisms that with evolutionist temporality and evolutionist ideologies that developed in the 19th century got flapped with that. So on the one hand, the tribe then becomes the lower and lesser form, the primitive form of the nation. It is not yet ready for self-government. It has to be then the natural law ideas, and then the justification of colonial ideas is that to say, okay, well, these ones, we have to then guide them to be able to bring them to where before we could grant them nation. There are all sorts of problems with this. The problem, though, that in Africa, the idea of native, the idea of tribe, the idea of even aboriginal, those ideas, all of them then had those evolutionist preconceptions built in them. Like Johannes Fabian says, for instance, the categories like words like tribes, those ones are already categories of evolutionist temporality and thought, and they already have built in them this devaluated idea that they are a lesser form of either cultural, political, or social organization. The problem with Africa then is that at independence, because I started by saying that the continent is basically the most diverse continent that you have, not only in terms of language and culture, people groups, DNA, and all of this, like in all its form, there was a challenge then. How do you forge together, holding on to this idea of nation? Because then you had to appeal to the Europeans and say, no, we are a nation. Therefore, we deserve independence. Again, going back to the colonial library, it forces you to adopt the language of the very thing that is oppressing you. It forces you to adopt. So even the nationalism that developed, you had to adopt the language that appeals to the very concept that the Europeans had used to devaluate yourself. And you say, but we are a nation, not a tribe. And therefore, we need independence and we need to forge the political community on the basis of this. The challenge to that, though, is that you have multiple ethnicities, multiple people groups that exist within these arbitrary spaces that have been created. So one of the challenges at independence was then we have a nation of diversity. The Jamaicans actually have, like, the best way of putting it, out of many, one. In Sierra Leone, we'd say one people, one country. But one people, one country does not necessarily mean that it is one people. But you have to impose this idea of the nation on this multiplicity and diverse and heterogeneous set of groups, because that is the only way in which you'll be able to stake a claim and say, we need juridical sovereignty within the confines of the modern Westphalian notions of nation state. So that is one. But the idea of pursuing emancipatory projects within that, well, the independence struggles were fought as coalitions of different ethnicities. There were, of course, dominant ethnic groups within that and dominant political formations, but it was always, whether it was in the Gambia or Senegal or in Sierra Leone or in Ghana, it was always a coalition of multiple ethnicities aspiring to that of the nation. But in the Pan-African idea, this was not enough. So, for instance, Nkrumah understood very early on, given the fractured nature of the political community, even though they are trying to unify it and say, we have the nation of Ghana, even whilst they are doing that, he understood that given the fractured nature of these multiple ethnicities, the only way you could avoid the kind of fragmentation that ultimately will come after independence was to unify the continent so that multiple ethnicities will exist and they will pursue their own individual strategies of community engagement and community sovereignty and building and all of that, but within a larger Pan-African body that does not aspire or speak to ethnicity, but that actually takes Africa, the continental Africa, as the unity or the unit that claims this sovereignty and as a nation. So the Pan-African idea itself then was precisely in response or in relation to the understanding that the fragmented nature or the balkanization of Africa and the way in which different kinds of identity groups exist within this, that there were problems with that. Then the idea then was that to create a larger Pan-African nation in which every African then would exist within their own cultural logic, but with the one unified continent protecting Africans everywhere. So again, going back to your question then, liberation on the basis of the nation state could only take you so far. And we saw that after the independence struggle, Mahmoud Mamdani has actually documented this very well in Citizen and Subject, that all of those ethnicities that united to fight against colonialism after independence started fragmenting along the very ethnic lines or the tribal lines that the British or the French or the Europeans had created, because tribalization, in inverted commas, of Africa was actually one of the ways in which the colonial enterprise was able to reproduce its logic and establish its hegemonic power over different groups. And I'll end on this. In my local language, Mende, there is no word for tribe. The way they refer to people, the word that we use is Kenye, which is like nation. So they will say, what people group. This is why when the Africans were doing the UNESCO General History, there was a problem then. How then do you describe the various groups that exist on the continent? And the label that they accepted, or the concept that they accepted, was people. So you have the concept of the peopling of Africa, right? So you have a different set of people. And actually the idea of people in my language is exactly how those various, what we call ethnicities or so-called tribes or nations, are actually described.
Thank you so much. I know we want to speak about Mudimbe and Ngugi or Thiong'o. I think it's important.
Let's go. That's fine.
Yeah. I mean, both of these great luminaries have recently passed away, so I think it's only fitting that we kind of, given that they have contributed significantly to the topics that we're talking about now, right, in various fields. But I think as someone who engages with African political decolonial thought, and I know we can talk about the decolonial, we can get into that a bit more, but I guess what do these two academics, figures, intellectuals represent for you when we think about how we come to speak about Africa and how we come to conceptualize the continent?
I mean, both of them, both of them were giants in their own right. I have been influenced more, when I was much younger, going to school in Sierra Leone, I was influenced by Ngũgĩ. But once I left Sierra Leone and read The Invention of Africa, my ideas about Africa changed considerably. And so Ngũgĩ and Mudimbe, if you want, you could actually, normally people will put Achebe and Ngũgĩ in opposition to each other, in the sense that there's this famous debate between Ngũgĩ and Achebe in terms of how exactly do we do African literature. And Ngũgĩ was saying it's only in Africa that which counts as literature is written in foreign language. That it is laughable, for instance, to think of Chinese literature that is written in English. The thing that is that the Chinese literature is written in Mandarin or whatever Chinese language is there, and then it is translated in English. So this is what he was pushing for, that colonialism, what it really did was basically also not just the physical form of taking over land and dominating people, but it was also creating these hierarchies in terms of languages. So cultural domination, especially linguistic domination. And for him then, liberation or decolonization had to proceed through linguistic liberation. That we actually have to be able to write in our own languages. We have to be able to, because he describes, and that was my experience going to school as well. In my school, Christ the King College in Bo in Sierra Leone, when you approach the school in the 80s and 90s, it was written very boldly, speak English, French, German, or Latin. Just think of that. Speak English, French, German, or Latin, because those were the languages that were being promoted in the school. And then there was this black button system that was in place. So we basically were taught to snitch on each other. So there is a black button that starts with somebody. Normally, the beginning, it starts with the class prefect. And then if you speak anything other than those 4 languages, then the button is passed to you. And then you have to sit there and wait. Even the idea of a black button, how racist and all of that. But let's put that to the side, right? So you have to sit there and look for the next person, because you don't want the button to end with you, because it's going to go, your name is going to go in the black book. And then that is going to be on your report card, and your parents are not going to like that, and all of this, right? So then we end up passing, and then by the end of the day, the person that the button ends with, their name goes in the black book, and the button stays with them. They come the next day, it's with them, and they start looking for the next person that transgresses by speaking just their native language. So this is the point. So when Ngũgĩ, and this was Ngũgĩ's experience, and imagine I went to school in the 80s and 90s. Ngũgĩ went to school in the 50s and 60s. So his was even rough than, because for us there had been certain changes that were going on, right? Anyway, so for Ngũgĩ then, to be able to center Africa, you needed linguistic sovereignty. Decolonization had to proceed, not only through those material economic processes of national remaking, but it had to be based on linguistic sovereignty, in which you are proud, but you also engage the world in your own language. Achebe had a different view, and it's like, our societies are so fractured, and the political legacy of colonialism that have been left exacerbates those divisions. So English or French, those languages, because we have already been colonized, they also become ours. And Mahmoud Mamdani also believes, he calls them colonial inherited languages, right? They also become ours. And conducting business in them, even though they were imposed by violence, some of the violence that I just described, but they also become neutral in the post-colonial space. Well, actually, they are not neutral, because we were making fun of people who couldn't speak English correctly. And I thought it was just the Anglophones that was doing that. Then I went to Senegal and realized that theirs is even worse. They will make fun of you, especially French is difficult to speak because of all of that lola and the genderization of words and stuff, right? And so it's easy for people to slip, and it's easy to make fun of them. So I do understand the position of Ngũgĩ, and I do understand the position of Achebe. Now, where does Mudimbe come into this? Well, for Mudimbe, the fact that Ngũgĩ even had to write in English to make this point proves that it is impossible, or it is difficult, not impossible, near and difficult, for us to be able to go back and just ignore language. That is one. But also the spaces that we inhabit have been so codified and transformed in the most violent way that any attempt at retrieving African cultures, every attempt at translating African cultures into either literature, literary criticism, or the frames of the disciplines, whether it is political science or anthropology or history or whatever it is, always represents a particular form of discursive and representational and translate the violence of translation. Because on the one hand, you will have to take something out of its own local context and then bring it into this space. So for him, that is not necessarily a bad thing if we are going to do that. But we don't have to then have this essentialist notion that only things that are in the context of the local rationality of these primordial discourses and ideas valid African experiences, because there is a tragic to colonial subject formation, and all of us have been woven through this. I mean, we are having this conversation in English, for instance, right? In other places, they will have it in French. But even the language that we speak in Sierra Leone on a day-to-day basis that we give to the rest of West Africa, the Creole language, or the Nigerian pidgin, if you want to call it that, has a mixture of English and local languages and words that have formed over time, and therefore that. So on the one hand, decolonization for Ngũgĩ was true linguistic sovereignty. On the other hand, for Mudimbe, it had to be through an invention. Africa has been invented violently by colonial modernity, but Africans also have to engage in the process of reinventing the continent, because whatever idea that we have of trying to go back to a pre-colonial purity, an essence that existed, one, it's impossible. In fact, it is a particular essentialist and problematic idea, because then you are assuming that African societies are static, and they have always been like that. So there is nothing wrong with going back to retrieving those cultures, but you have to understand that when you are retrieving those cultures, you are also transforming them in the base so that, and putting them to current use. Then this goes back to history. Even when we say, oh, let's retrieve history. For Mudimbe, the retrieval of history is always viewed from the temporal present. It is our current situation that allows us to read things the way in which we read them. The violence of colonial modernity is that we have to challenge it furiously, but we also have to adapt ideas. And if you take like Marxism, for instance, and the way in which people like Nkrumah, even though he was the most Pan-African person that you could think of, adapted Marxist concepts within the local space. And that then allowed for different kinds of transformations and stuff. So the issue then in terms of how you decolonize Africa, or the issue of the debates between Achebe and Ngũgĩ on the one hand, or if you put Mudimbe and Ngũgĩ in conversation, is to say that it has never been settled. There has never been one particular way in which Africans have thought of this idea of decolonization, but that decolonization itself represents an ideal that is based on debates that are unfolding in different situations, and different people have different ways in which they think of it. But all of them agree that the structures of colonial modernity, the violence of its archival and representational schemas, its linguistic sovereignty and devaluation of African linguistics, so African languages and subjectivities has to be challenged and transformed. How we transform that, Nkrumah will say, the Pan-African idea. But Mudimbe will say, well, the Pan-African idea is also just like negritude. It is a creation. It's an invention, right? And so these two giants, like Ngũgĩ speaks to me because when I was in school, what he's describing and this idea of linguistic sovereignty is something that I experienced in terms of the black button system. But Mudimbe speaks to me because I also do understand that if we have to recreate the world, then we can't just rely on our ancestors. We draw lessons from them, but we use our own present in order to be able. And this is why, and I'll end on this, Frantz Fanon has this beautiful line, black skin, white mask. So he develops this critique of negritude and all of this, right? But then he says, my interest is not to try and retrieve an African culture, a lost African history or culture at the expense of the violence of colonial domination, alienation, exploitation. The Indo-Chinese, the people of Vietnam, were not fighting because they had discovered a certain cultural truth about their past. They are resisting because in more than one ways, they have found it difficult to breed. And you could extend that to the Chinese and say, China has not been able to emerge as this giant global power that in the last 500 years, the first non-European power to be at the cusp of becoming a global hegemon is China. But China did not do that by merely appealing to culture. They did that by reorganizing their productive forces. They adapted Marxian thought to a particular social praxis, revolutionary praxis, and took elements from different places in order to be able. So whilst they were based, their process was based on local Chinese conditions, they were reading the world and borrowing elements to bring into the political project that they were creating. And this is what has led them to where they are. And China is not feared because of its culture. We have Chinese, the last podcast I did say this, we have Chinese restaurants everywhere. We eat Chinese food. We celebrate Chinese New Year. Heck, we manufacture all of our goods in China. So we are not afraid of China because of their culture, because they are claiming their culture. We are afraid of China because they have been able to reimagine themselves within the rhythms of modernity and appropriated elements to the point that they are now at the cusp of becoming global power that will supersede the Anglo-American system that developed out of the expansion of Europe in the 15th century onwards. And so when we think of Pan-Africanism and coming back to Ngũgĩ and Fanon and Achebe and Mudimbe, then the idea is then how do we create, going back also to Christian's question, in terms of putting forth a liberationary project, Pan-African liberationary project. Then the idea is that how do we create and forge that process that does not let go of our local languages, but at the same time allow us to be able to exist in the world and being able to engage the world and being able to appropriate from the world and bring it to our own situations so that we are able to transform our condition and our place and position in the world.
Thank you so much, and I always appreciate that you bring it back to the material. And I think it's also important that when we think about these thinkers, you always, like, people are not writing for no reason, right? When you look at the Sheikh Anta Jobs of the world, or you look at the Nkrumahs, or you look at the Ngugi and the Mudimbes, they're writing in response to something. Right? Yeah. And I think that's important. And so I will let Christian go, but I think I'll circle a bit back to that point. Christian, go ahead.
Well, I guess I have more of a comment because I wanted to affirm a lot of this because it takes me back to some of the organizing I do and some of the experiences and even the debates that we have that happen on the ground that I think are very much mirrored by these conversations. And it makes me think of an elder and a comrade telling me about, I organized in New York City and Brooklyn, and how some guy in Brooklyn, his whole project was he wanted everyone to start speaking Kemetic, which is an ancient language that no one currently natively speaks. And the question becomes, you're so entrenched in trying to, recover this Kemetic language, but it doesn't have any grounding because there's almost, and I'm not trying to reduce this to a question of pragmatism, but it has no real, it's not a part of any sort of real existing social relation. But I guess to that is I guess I want to take it back, or I want to take this conversation about language and the conversations regarding Achebe, Mudimbe, and Ngũgĩ about, is there anything that can be done linguistically? Because we talked about nations being a coalition of what we may call ethnicities or a grouping of peoples. But is there, I think a Pan-African project even goes to a higher level of that. Is there something linguistically that can be done for a Pan-African project? And I know there's been historically things around Swahili and whatnot, but how does this get elevated to another level?
I mean, the thing is that, and this is, Nkrumah is so underrated. But the Ghanaians, by the way, after having betrayed Nkrumah, the new generation of Ghanaians have now come to rehabilitate him, and they understand that he was way ahead of his time. And they are actually mad at their political formations and stuff, right? Mahama is actually an Nkrumahist. He basically says, had it not been for Nkrumah, he would not have gone to school, right? And all of this. But let's come back to this question, right? Nkrumah was way ahead of his time. And what he basically said was this idea of language that, again, we have to understand that Africa is the most diverse continent by every metric. Language, culture, like genetics, DNA, and all of this, right? And so, but Nkrumah was like, these are practical problems that could be fixed, right? There are language belts. North Africa already has, even though there is North Africa it's predominantly Berber, but Arabic is a hegemonic language in the north. So that problem is already solved, right? The East African coast already has Swahili. Now, West Africa, Mandingo is one of the languages. Fulani, I am sure Momodu is Fulani in some extent.
I am. Tukolor. I'm Tukolor.
You are Tukolor. You see, so Fulani, the language, it's spoken from Senegal to Ghana, northern Nigeria and stuff. So then the idea is that Nkrumah was like, we could have everybody live within their own linguistic bubble, but we create these larger regional languages that everybody, so people are taught in, that everybody, and those becomes the working languages of the continent, on top of then the colonial languages if people want to use them. So we could have just used Swahili, but even in East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, they speak Swahili. The Kenyans think that they are more, again, because of this colonial linguistic hierarchies, the Kenyans think that they are more civilized or more advanced than the Tanzanians. Why? Because Tanzania, years back, decided to make primary education exclusively in Kiswahili. So whilst they speak better Kiswahili than everybody else, they struggle with language because you only get, you have exclusive primary education in Kiswahili, but you learn English, and then as you go through the schooling system, then now it changes to English. But the Kenyans start from the beginning in English. So the value and the hierarchy that the colonial linguistic policy created in that region continues to still inform the way in which we think. I was actually at a conference in Tanzania, it was in May, late April, May, and one of the presentations was in Kiswahili. I was so happy. And the person was describing the difficulty that they have had. This is a Kiswahili professor at the university, and the way in which other people look at them and say, you are not doing a better job. So Nkrumah had said, this is not an issue. China basically you have Mandarin and Cantonese. Does that mean that those are the only languages that exist in China? Hell no. India, you speak Hindi and Tamil and stuff, right? But there are also lots of different languages that exist, but those are hegemonic languages. So within the Pan-African confines, Nkrumah was like, basically, once we unite, all of those other problems become practical problems that we'll have to solve. Let's say, for instance, if East Africa had decided in the 60s that Kiswahili was what was going to be taught in schools, and everybody adopted that, you train people in it, by now, on top of the Kiswahili belt that they have, it would have been the most dominant language, right? In West Africa, there is a little bit of a problem. The Fulani are saying, because they are pastoralists, and they are saying as outsiders, cattle rearers that came and took over certain places. Those histories exist, and people therefore look at the Fula in a certain way. Like, here's the point. Sekou Touré had a problem with them, of course, in Guinea. In Sierra Leone, our present vice president is Fula. The idea then is that he should run to be president for the ruling party the next election round. And there are people who are like, no, we can't have a Fula be president of Sierra Leone. The point that I am making here is that there are all of these historical divisions that we have accepted in our own societies and reproduce them without even realizing the kind of violence and the kind of colonial and palimpsestic violence that we are reproducing in our own societies. In Nigeria, if you were to say, let's impose Hausa Fulani as the language, or you take a 3-language belt, there is Yoruba, and there is Igbo, and then there is, of course, Hausa Fulani, then that also becomes a problem. This is why Achebe, looking at the Nigeria situation, was saying, let us just stay with English and Pidgin. The point, though, is that these are practical problems. These are instrumental problems for politicians or those in power to be able to address. If we have a continental Africa, then those problems could be addressed at the policy level. The point, though, is in East Africa, despite whatever it is, the colonial inheritance, Swahili keeps spreading. It is spoken in Congo, it is spoken in Rwanda, it's spoken in Burundi. It is just, so the Swahili belt is extending. And I think, imagine if you made a concerted effort to promote these languages, what it will mean. It would then mean that the world will come to us on our own terms. And we will engage the world on our own terms, in terms of linguistic what. However, since the 1980s, or since the language of English has also now become, even the French are jealous, right? This is why in Canada we have all of this problem with Quebecois nationalism. It's like they are imposing all of these restrictions on languages and all of this and stuff. Because they also understand that English is basically swallowing everybody. One, because of the Britain colonized half of the world, and secondly, the American power after the end of empire has been also. So English is not a bad language to adopt. But if you go to Turkey, they speak Turkish and then they learn English. And I think, I don't want to be language essentialist, but I think Ngũgĩ is right when he says language is actually the motor or the vehicle of culture. And so when if you want to destroy a culture, you destroy language. And there are so many languages that are going extinct in Africa. In Sierra Leone, years back, they decided to do away with that colonial stuff where you were punished for speaking your native language, and they introduced different kinds of languages that are taught in school. But hegemonically, you still have to go to school. Your education is still primarily in English. So anyway, Christian, coming back to your problem, is you're asking me about very practical issues. I'm not a politician, but I think if we take the continental unity and Pan-Africanism as the basis of our mode of operation, then Nkrumah was right when he says these language problems are practical problems that could be solved. They are not that difficult to solve. China did it, India did it, different places did it, and we should be able to do it. Maybe we will have to have, like Switzerland or Belgium, multiple languages, not the local languages, but the dominant languages. So Arabic would be one of them. English and French, obviously, for whatever reason, because of their colonial heritage. But we could develop, let's say, Kiswahili for East Africa, and then Kiswahili for East and Southern Africa. And then we decide on whether it's Madingo or Fula, because those are the two dominant languages that are spoken across most of the countries in West Africa anyway. So is it Fula or Madingo? I don't know, right? But we also have to understand that in doing that, and this is why Mudimbe is important, in doing that, we are also inventing. And there is also some violence that come with that because you are imposing a larger language on top of those local languages. But it doesn't matter because then, like for instance, we could take Creole. Already, because Nigeria is like 100 and almost 200 million people, that's half of West Africa. We speak Creole. Gambia, they speak Creole. Ghana, Cameroon, that could also be another language that could be expanded. And then we could engage the world on our own basis, where the world comes to us. They have to translate our stuff, but we also translate their stuff into our stuff. So again, these are practical problems that could be solved. I think our job is to think of the condition of possibility of these processes. What does it entail? What does it mean to have linguistic sovereignty? What will it take for us to be able to actually do some of those things that Nkrumah was talking about? That's not our job to implement, but our job is to think the condition of possibility of these processes and identify where problems might be, ways of going around those problems, but what the implications for the larger Pan-African project of African liberation.
Thank you so much. So I guess I have two questions now. The first question I have is, so is it actually possible to speak about Africa without going through the colonial library? And the second thing is, given our current and contemporary moment and thinking about the continent of Africa, what do these thinkers as Mudimbe and Ngugi offer us today?
So, on the question of the colonial library, I'm actually completing a book. The book is practically done. I just have to put finishing touches here and there, which is basically on this very question that you just asked me. So far, what I have written is that it is almost impossible to come to Africa innocently. Even those of us who were born and raised on the continent and who have had to live, sometimes we talk, we imagine ourselves in the language that already has been bequeathed us. So for Mudimbe, what issue here is not that you don't have African cultures that exist, but the way in which we imagine and talk about them is the problem, and the way we experience them. And anthropology, colonial anthropology, which was really basically the justification of colonial rule, created categories and concepts, fetish, tribe, and like all of this stuff, right? Where it becomes very difficult, and the colonial anthropology created these categories and a particular form of discourses that exist within the library, but it made it, and then it's also the basis of African studies. So according to Mudimbe, colonial anthropology is actually the epistemological locus of African studies. This is why in African studies, for instance, if you want to produce knowledge about Africa, people freak out if you just theorize, as if Africans can't theorize. They will ask you, where is your empirical basis? Meaning, you should do field work. If you don't believe me, Momodu, check. Almost every African studies journal that exists. I mean, the big ones came from colonial anthropology anyway. Africa, African Affairs, those ones, right? But if you were to modern African journal, like all of those African studies journals, they insist that your intervention be based on some type of field work or empirical material that is gotten from. So you're not allowed to speculate. Europe could speculate about themselves, but we are not allowed to speculate because of this. So you could live in Africa, you experience Africa in a different way. The issue though is that once you start to talk about it, to describe your experience, it doesn't mean that you don't know, we know. But especially within the confines of the modern disciplines and within the confines of the modern nation state, the practices that are put in place to reproduce the post-colonial state and its politics, and the practices that are put in place to understand Africa on the basis of intellectual information and all of this, we are almost always under threat of reproducing the violence of the library. So that some of the smartest people that I know, they could engage in critique. But the moment they try to venture to actually describe Africa, they fall into the same racialist and colonial caricature of the continent. Let us take Achille Mbembe, for instance. Everybody loves him. He's a great social theorist and stuff, right? And he writes on the post-colony, in which he is basically trying to react to all of the problematic racist evolutionist ideas about African politics that had developed up to that time. He's even responding to Jean-François Bayard, for instance, right, about, the African historicity there is. And Mbembe is like, well, there is really no distinctive African historicity that is not already embedded with the rhythms and the times of European domination and stuff. So if we want to talk about African historicity, then we have to think about not only what happens on the continent, but also in relation to what happens elsewhere, the way Africa exists in the world. Fine. So fantastic critique. And then there's this chapter where he's talking about the colonial imposition as naked violence, the primary violence, the legitimative violence. Like he has all of these ideas. He calls it the colonial commandment. Okay. Then now he goes to describe the state. Guess how he describes it? The African state is just basically, he reduces the Africans to physicality, to our baser instincts. Politics in Africa and the state in Africa, it's only about obsession with genital organs, loud fats, fecal matter, the phallus. This is him. The same person who is telling you that these people are producing racist ideas about Africa is the same person that is reproducing and reinforcing that very caricature that is based in the colonial archive. So, on the one hand, is it possible to produce knowledge about Africa differently? Valentin Mudimbe is like, yes. You have to engage Africa as a system in its own right, bearing in mind that any attempt to translate Africa into the disciplines is going to lead to a particular form of conceptual bridging, which is itself violent and therefore takes those things out of their context of rationality. The problem, though, is that so he's like, yes, engage Africa on the basis of its own history, within the context of its own rationality. But when you do that, you end up with like Bayat, for instance, the state in Africa, where everything is the politics of the belly, or you end up with Bembe, where it is an obsession with the fallows and all of this. So I guess I am trying to say that it is complicated. It is not yes or no. The colonial library it's not totalizing because there is no discursive or system of operation that does not have discursive exteriors in which, right? And these texts are themselves unstable. Like, so in relation to Africa, for instance, in the colonial library, you find literature of devaluation and you find literature of celebration. So for every white man's grave, there is an Akkadian landscape. But the problem, though, is that these are just two sides of the same coin, right? An invented Africa. So Africa has been made to bear this double burden of monstrosity on the one hand and nobility on the other. And I don't think this is how we experience Africa. Africa just is this place that has a multiplicity of experiences. And those experiences should be celebrated. Like I normally tell my students, I was like, look, I'm not going to be your token angry black man. Because there was a time when my existence here was governed by that. I will not raise my voice because I don't want people to see another angry black man. But it got to the point where I'm like, but if I don't raise my voice and I'm living according to the expectations that people have and the fear that they are going to judge me in a certain way, they've already won because that's what they want. So I normally tell them, I am a complex human being. I do laugh. I do cry. I do feel happy. I do feel sad sometimes. Sometimes I am hungry. Sometimes I am full. Sometimes I am tired. Sometimes I am, motivated to work. And sometimes I just feel lazy. These are like the full range of human emotions. We are complex beings. And as Africans, we should be able to express that. So you can't say we exist only between depravity and nobility. The idea of African nobility, if that becomes the way in which you are creating and looking at Africa, then again, you are reproducing this myth, this fabulous idea of what Africa is and is not. So the issue here then is that how do we then talk about ourselves, produce knowledge about our societies, understand our societies without recourse to the library? Because the library is contaminating and it always insinuates itself in projects that are actually trying to refute its claims. So for Mudimbe, for instance, like the first generation, independent generation of African academics, they were challenging the colonial library, but they were also being governed by the conceptualities of the library. And so Sheikh Anta Diop, for instance, right? He had to create this idea that there is a cultural unity to Africa, just like there's a cultural unity to Europe. And therefore, if Greece is central to European civilization, then Egypt has to be central to African civilization. Fantastic work. Is it a work of invention? And is it being informed in some sense by the colonial library? Absolutely. So, but we have to invent. So that is the first part of the question. The second part is these questions about how to imagine Africa, how to talk about Africa, how to think about current situation are not really separate. The colonial library exists precisely because of the violence, colonial palimpsestic violence, and its archival and representational schemas that continue to this day to impact the way in which the continent is seen in the world, the way in which the continent is imagined, and the way we imagine ourselves. I remember when I was in university, I had a friend. Whenever something goes wrong, he will rub his index finger on his skin, basically trying to insinuate that the black skin has a problem and we are always never able to rise above our bestiality or the way in which we have been codified within the colonial library. I'm not making this up. This was in university. Whenever something happens, he basically will rub his hand on his skin to say, our blackness is the problem. It is what essentially explains about our incompetencies, about our violent nature, about how cruel we are, about how insincere, about how do you say now, like capricious and all of this. People believe some of this stuff. And so whatever it is that they are saying in terms of how to understand the current situation is not devoid from the histories that have constituted the current situation. That is the first thing. So the library and those descriptions did not imagine a vacuum. Every discursive emergence is reproduced within the frame of real material situation. There is a real material basis to discourses of devaluation and all of this. And colonialism had to justify itself. If you are enslaving people, you have to justify how bestial they are, how not so good humans they are. Or if you want to colonize them, you have to say how primitive their systems are. Like all of this, right? So then the question is then, engaging with a concept like the colonial library or the way in which Africa is represented and talked about is not an idle talk. But it should be linked to the material basis. Amilcar Cabral, I did say this the last time, but he's one of my favorite sons of Africa, favorite ancestors. Do not think that people accept the sacrifice that the revolution demands, that people care about what is in your head. They want to see their lives go forward, to see their kids live in peace. They want to have food on the table. So the materiality of the current existence, and this is why I was referring to Fanon, and this is why I was referring to the example of China and Indochina. The reality of it then is that those discourses and the challenge in the library should allow us to be able to wage strategic struggles in the present, to not only escape its debilitating impact on African societies, but to imagine the creation of a new society. So when Mudimbe talks about invention, what he's really thinking about then is that we have to escape the library and create Africa that goes beyond it, that speaks to the aspirations. Of course, Ngũgĩ, linguistic sovereignty, allows us to be able to center ourselves in the world, and we engage the world on that basis. And don't forget, Ngũgĩ was always Marxist. So everything that he's writing was always linked to the material question. And so all of these guys, Ngũgĩ, Fanon, Achebe, the generation of African academics that came before us, Joseph Kizabo, Fabian Ibusi Bulaga, Kwesi Weredu, like all of these guys, the idea was not just producing knowledge on the basis of knowledge. It was always allowing us to be able to understand our own situation so that we are able to wage strategic battles. And Pauline Hutunji actually, and I will end on this, Pauline Hutunji actually wrote something before he passed. He was like, look, we have to reclaim our cultures and we have to remain located in our cultures. But we should also be able to access the tradition, the global tradition of knowledge that exists, adapt it to our own local condition from our own location, and engage in strategic projects that allow us to be able to reimagine Africa and reimagine our location and our position in the world.
And I think that is a brilliant way, because I know that ending will lead us to our next two episodes. Thank you so much. That was another masterclass as always.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
Until next time. All right. Take care.
Okay.